Israel launches a new wave of strikes across Gaza as the ceasefire framework comes under renewed pressure and plans for an international stabilization force remain incomplete. Russia and Ukraine enter another round of escalation, with new strikes reported, Britain and France moving to share Storm Shadow and Scalp technology, and Kyiv pressing for more Patriot missiles before winter. Washington removes Syria from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, opening the door to broader engagement with Damascus. The United States launches Operation Economic Outcasts against Iran, while Tehran hardens its response and shipping through Hormuz remains sharply reduced. France and Saudi Arabia unveil a major investment project near Paris. The U.S. Canada trade war turns personal as Doug Ford tells Trump to kiss my ass, and Trump fires back on Truth Social. Russia launches another military satellite. And in Leaders on X, Poland receives new K2 tanks, Macron promotes Saudi investment, and Modi marks 10 years of UPI. Israel has carried out a new series of strikes across Gaza, with attacks reported in Burej and Khan Yunis, and tank fire used in other parts of the enclave. The Israeli military says it targeted Hamas weapons storage sites and militant infrastructure, including sites it says operated from civilian areas. The strikes came only days after a U.S. delegation led by Jared Kushner urged Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to reduce military activity and focus on advancing the ceasefire framework. Washington is still pushing for movement on the next stages of the plan, including Hamas disarmament, further Israeli withdrawals and reconstruction arrangements. But the sequence remains disputed. Israel says a withdrawal cannot take place until Hamas is fully disarmed, while Hamas and its supporters accuse Israel of using continued military operations to delay implementation of the agreement. At the same time, preparations are continuing for an international security force in Gaza. Military officials from Uganda and Burundi recently visited Israel to discuss possible participation in the U.S.-backed mission. Uganda has already approved the deployment of around 1,200 troops, while Burundi is still considering whether to join. The proposed international stabilization force is intended to monitor the ceasefire, secure aid deliveries, and help train Palestinian police. The broader plan envisions a force of around 20,000 personnel, but current commitments remain well below that level. Morocco, Kosovo, Kazakhstan, and Albania have also been discussed as possible contributors, while Indonesia has suspended an earlier plan to send troops. The central problem is that the military and political tracks are moving at different speeds. Israeli strikes are continuing, the multinational force is still being assembled, and the dispute over whether disarmament or withdrawal comes first remains unresolved. That leaves the ceasefire formally in place, but under growing pressure, with every new round of strikes making the transition to a more stable security arrangement more difficult. For the United States, the immediate challenge is to prevent the Gaza framework from becoming a ceasefire in name only. For Israel, the priority remains preventing Hamas from rebuilding military capability. And for potential troop-contributing countries, the question is whether there will be a clear mandate and enough political agreement on the ground to make deployment viable. In the Odessa region, Ukraine's border guard service says the international crossing at Vinohradivka on the border with Moldova suffered serious damage after a drone strike. Images from the site showed a major fire and destruction around the checkpoint. In Dnipro, local sources reported another large fire at a shopping complex after an overnight strike. The exact type of weapon has not been independently confirmed. Farther east, a powerful explosion was also reported near Novomoskovsk in the Dnipropetrovsk region, producing a large column of smoke. The target and the weapon used remain unclear. On the ground, Russia's defense ministry says forces from the center grouping captured Anovka in the Donetsk region. The claim has not been independently verified. The new strikes come as Ukraine's Western partners move to expand Kyiv's long-range capabilities. Britain and France are preparing to share key Storm Shadow and Scalp technology with Ukraine, allowing Ukrainian industry to participate more directly in future production and assembly. Moscow has already warned that facilities connected to such production could become targets. Ukraine is also pressing for more air defense ammunition before winter. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Kyiv needs a large package of Patriot interceptors to protect cities and energy infrastructure during the cold season. European officials are simultaneously discussing stronger air defense support and additional pressure on Russia's Shadow Fleet. Black Sea access remains another major concern. Zelensky says Russia is trying to move toward a complete blockade of Ukraine's maritime routes, while traffic through the ports of Greater Odessa has already fallen sharply. Kyiv says diplomatic and military options are being discussed to keep the grain corridor operating. Ukraine also used its Independence Day events to showcase the changing character of the war. Aerial drones flew over Kyiv, ground robotic systems moved through Independence Square, and naval drones were demonstrated on the Dnipro, underlining how unmanned systems have become central to Ukraine's battlefield strategy. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas used the same period to call for tougher sanctions on Moscow this autumn, more support for Ukrainian air defense, and tighter restrictions on Russia's shadow fleet. She argued that increasing military and economic pressure is necessary to force Moscow back toward negotiations. That pressure is now building on several fronts. The United States has removed Syria from its list of state sponsors of terrorism, ending a designation that had been in place since 1979 and opening the door to a broader reset in relations with Damascus. The decision lifts some restrictions that had limited American assistance, exports and financial transactions involving Syria. Washington also removed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as the al-Nusra Front, from its sanctions list of global terrorist organizations. The move reflects the Trump administration's effort to dismantle parts of the sanctions architecture built around the Assad government after the change of power in Damascus. The shift could have immediate economic consequences. Syria's reconstruction has been constrained by sanctions, banking restrictions, and limited access to international finance. Removing the terrorism designation does not eliminate every barrier, but it makes it easier for foreign governments, banks, and companies to consider re-engagement without the same level of legal and financial risk. At the same time, Washington is not removing all pressure. Personal sanctions against Bashar al-Assad, members of his former inner circle, and other designated individuals remain in place. U.S. officials are presenting the policy as a selective opening rather than a complete normalization of relations. The political signal is broader than the sanctions themselves. Washington is effectively saying that the post-Assad authorities in Damascus will be judged separately from the previous government, and that economic reintegration is possible if the new leadership meets American expectations on security and regional stability. For Syria, the decision could improve access to investment, aid, and international trade as the country tries to rebuild state institutions. For the United States, it creates a new channel of influence in Damascus, while keeping targeted sanctions available as leverage if relations deteriorate. The United States has opened a new phase of its pressure campaign against Iran, combining expanded sanctions with a warning that military strikes remain an option. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced Operation Economic Outcasts, aimed at cutting Iran off from oil revenue, financial channels, and foreign intermediaries. More than 60 companies, individuals, and vessels have already been targeted, while Washington says banks and other organizations that continue helping Tehran move money could be excluded from the U.S. dollar system. Tehran says it expected the move. Iranian officials claim the government has prepared a 2-year plan to absorb the pressure and keep trade and financial channels functioning. They also warn that Iran's response will not necessarily remain defensive. The military threat has also returned to the foreground. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the United States is not ruling out new strikes if Iran attacks American forces or crosses what Washington considers a red line, including in or around the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping through Hormuz remains heavily disrupted. One report says only 17 cargo ships crossed the strait over 2 days, compared with roughly 130 a day before the war. Iran has also threatened detention, fines, or confiscation for vessels that violate its passage rules. At the same time, Pakistan says significant progress has been made toward restoring the U.S.-Iran memorandum, keeping a diplomatic channel open. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for freedom of navigation in Hormuz and an end to attacks on commercial shipping across the region. Washington is therefore tightening economic pressure and keeping force on the table, while Tehran signals both resistance and a willingness to preserve negotiations. France and Saudi Arabia are expanding economic cooperation with a major investment project planned for Cergy-Pontoise, northwest of Paris. The initiative includes 3 new theme parks and is expected to bring around €6 billion in investment to the area. French President Emmanuel Macron says the project could create approximately 22,000 jobs and become one of the largest new leisure and tourism developments in the region. The agreement is part of a broader effort by Paris and Riyadh to deepen commercial ties beyond traditional energy and defense cooperation. Both sides are increasingly emphasizing investment, technology, tourism, and large-scale infrastructure as central pillars of the relationship. For France, the project offers a significant injection of foreign capital and new employment. For Saudi Arabia, it provides another major foothold in the European leisure and entertainment sector as Riyadh continues to diversify its international investments. The deal also gives Macron a concrete economic result from the latest round of talks with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, turning a diplomatic visit into a large domestic investment announcement. The U.S. Canada trade dispute has turned increasingly personal as tariff tensions spill into an open political feud between Donald Trump and Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Ford publicly told Trump he could kiss my ass over the latest U.S. pressure, then doubled down when asked whether Prime Minister Mark Carney had urged him to soften his language. He said Carney had not objected and continued attacking Trump's trade strategy. Trump answered on Truth Social, mocking Ford as less charismatic and less intelligent than his late brother Rob Ford, and referring to Carney as the governor of Canada. He also accused the United States of having carried Canada for decades and warned of more serious consequences if Ottawa does not change course. Ford then escalated again, calling Trump a bully and a loser, and promising to take the argument directly to U.S. governors, senators, and members of Congress. The dispute is no longer only about tariffs. It is becoming a public test of political resolve on both sides of the border, with personal attacks now reinforcing the economic confrontation. Russia has launched another military spacecraft from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in the Arkhangelsk region. The Defense Ministry says a Soyuz 2.1B rocket lifted off from Plesetsk and successfully placed a military satellite into its target orbit. Russian Space Forces established telemetry contact with the spacecraft after launch and reported that its onboard systems were operating normally. Moscow has not disclosed the satellite's specific mission or payload. The launch was conducted by a combat crew of the Russian Aerospace Forces and is part of a continuing series of classified military missions from Plesetsk, Russia's main launch site for defense-related spacecraft. The launch comes as the war in Ukraine increasingly extends into the space and communications domain. Russian military satellites support functions such as navigation, communications, reconnaissance, and early warning, while Ukraine has also targeted facilities connected to Russia's space industry. For Moscow, maintaining regular launches is therefore not only a space program issue, but part of preserving military infrastructure that supports operations on the ground. The satellite itself remains classified. Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz says Poland has received the first 28 K2 tanks under its new contract with South Korea. He also announced the next phase of the Safe Procurement Program and a major new order for Polish-made Piorun air defense missiles, presenting the deliveries as part of Poland's broader military modernization. French President Emmanuel Macron says France and Saudi Arabia are expanding economic cooperation through a major investment project near Paris. The plan includes 3 new theme parks in Cergy-Pontoise, around €6 billion in investment and an estimated 22,000 jobs, with Paris presenting the project as a major boost for investment and employment. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is marking 10 years of UPI, India's digital payment system. Modi says the platform has become a major part of the country's digital transformation, changing how millions of people make everyday payments, expanding access to cashless transactions, and demonstrating the growing scale of India's digital economy.